You sit after prayer and something feels wrong. The prayer was good. You were focused. You recited carefully. You made dua. And yet, a few minutes later, the same insecurity returns. The same restlessness. The same need to feel certain that you are doing well with Allah. You fast. You wake up for tahajjud. You resist a temptation nobody knows about. You lower your gaze when nobody would have blamed you for looking. Then something appears in the heart, not arrogant, not the kind of pride that announces itself. Something quieter, a feeling that whispers, maybe I am becoming one of the good ones. Most people never question that feeling. After all, it arrived after worship. It came wearing religious clothes. It sounded spiritual, but Ibn Arabi says something deeply unsettling. The greatest spiritual veil is not always sin. Sometimes it is becoming fascinated with your own obedience. Sometimes the thing you believe is bringing you closer to Allah, quietly turns your attention back toward yourself. And that is exactly why Ujub is so dangerous. Because, unlike obvious sins, it often grows in the soil of good deeds. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Ujub develops, why it destroys sincerity from the inside, why Ibn Arabi considered it a profound error in perception, and what practical steps you can take to protect your relationship with Allah from one of the most invisible diseases of the soul. Before we begin, let me show you exactly where we are going. In this video, we are going to walk through 6 stages. First, we will uncover why the most dangerous form of pride often appears inside worship itself. Then we will examine how the nafs secretly turns good deeds into personal possessions. After that, Ibn Arabi will show us why being impressed with your sincerity may already be damaging your sincerity. Then we will look at the hidden relationship between self-image and spiritual blindness. After that, we will discover the shocking difference between seeing your actions and seeing Allah's action through you. And finally, we will learn 3 practical ways to dismantle Ujub before it corrupts your relationship with Allah. One of the strange realities of modern life is that nearly everything pushes you toward self-construction. Every platform asks you to create a profile, build a reputation, measure progress, display achievements, curate an identity. Over time, that habit becomes so normal that it quietly enters religion. Prayer becomes a performance review. Knowledge becomes a brand. Service becomes a personality. You begin evaluating your relationship with Allah using the same psychological habits you use to evaluate your career, your appearance, or your social standing. The problem is not worship. The problem is ownership. This is exactly where Ibn Arabi becomes relevant. Many people know him as a mystic. Many know him as a poet. But Ibn Arabi spent his life wrestling with a much larger question. What belongs to Allah and what belongs to creation? In his monumental work, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, he repeatedly returns to the idea that human beings fall into confusion whenever they attribute independent power, existence, or ownership to themselves. For Ibn Arabi, spiritual diseases are not merely moral failures, they are failures of perception. You are seeing reality incorrectly, and once perception becomes distorted, sincerity becomes distorted as well. Ujub is a perfect example. Most people define it as self. Ibn Arabi takes us deeper. Ujub begins when a servant starts seeing himself as the source of goodness instead of the recipient of divine generosity. Modern psychology calls part of this process self-serving bias. Researchers have found that people naturally attribute successes to themselves while explaining failures through external causes. The ego instinctively claims ownership of what makes it look good. Ibn Arabi described the same tendency centuries earlier. Science describes what is happening. Ibn Arabi tells you what to do about it. And what he reveals is uncomfortable, because the greatest danger is not that you think highly of yourself. The greatest danger is that you stop seeing Allah's mercy behind everything good within you. Think of a 28-year-old accountant during Ramadan. For years he struggled to wake up for tahajjud. Every night he set alarms. Every night he failed. Then suddenly something changed. This Ramadan he started waking consistently. The first week felt miraculous. The second week felt beautiful. The third week felt different. Now he notices something else happening. When co-workers mention being tired because they stayed awake watching videos, he feels a small sense of superiority. When friends talk about sleeping through Fajr, he quietly compares himself. He never says anything. He would never openly boast. Yet every prayer adds another brick to an invisible structure inside him. A structure built from self-admiration. The irony is devastating. The worship meant to humble him is feeding a hidden sense of distinction. This is exactly what Ibn Arabi is describing in Al-Futuhat Al-Marqiyah. He repeatedly warns that spiritual states are gifts from Allah, not possessions of the servant. The danger begins when gratitude slowly transforms into ownership. When Allah allowed me becomes I achieved. When Allah guided me becomes I am different. When Allah opened this door becomes I deserve this door. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever completed an act of worship and immediately started evaluating what it says about you? Not what it says about Allah, what it says about you. Because that tiny shift matters more than most people realize. Imagine a window standing in a room filled with sunlight. The room becomes bright because light passes through the glass. Now imagine the window becoming impressed with itself. Imagine it saying, "Look how much brightness I have produced." The absurdity is obvious. The window contributed nothing, it simply received. Yet this is precisely what happens inside the heart. Allah opens a door. Allah grants energy. Allah provides guidance. Allah protects you from distractions. Allah creates circumstances that make obedience possible. Then the nafs quietly steps forward and says, "Look what I accomplished." The Quran cuts directly through this illusion. Allah says, "Had it not been for the favor of Allah upon you and His mercy, none of you would ever have been purified." Think about that. Not some of you, not most of you, none of you. The verse leaves no room for spiritual ownership. Every good deed exists inside divine generosity. Every act of obedience begins with divine permission. Every moment of sincerity is already a gift before it becomes your action. And here is where many sincere people become trapped. They do not become proud of worship. They become proud of being the kind of person who worships. That distinction changes everything. The servant is no longer looking at Allah. The servant is looking at himself, looking at Allah. The spotlight moves, and once the spotlight moves, sincerity starts weakening. Not because worship stopped, because attention changed. You know this. Experience. You leave a gathering feeling inspired. Then 5 minutes later you are thinking about how inspired you felt. You finish a good deed. Then you begin admiring the fact that you finished it. The deed ends. Self-consciousness begins. The nafs is incredibly subtle. It rarely attacks worship directly. It simply tries to become the owner of worship afterward. And that is why Ujub can grow inside. sincere people more easily than inside careless people. The more good deeds you collect, the more opportunities the ego has to collect them too. The moment you own the gift, you lose sight of the giver. But if Ujub begins with ownership of actions, there is a deeper level that most people never notice. Because eventually, the ego stops claiming your deeds. It starts claiming your identity. Think of a 35-year-old Islamic teacher. Every week, he posts reminders online. People thank him. People benefit. People praise his knowledge. He tells himself he does not care about recognition. And for the most part, he believes that. Then one evening, he reads a critical comment. The comment stays with him. For hours, he keeps replaying it. His mood changes. His confidence drops. Suddenly, he realizes something. Praise lifts him. Criticism wounds him. Why? Because his identity has become attached to being seen as righteous. This is where things become uncomfortable. Many people are not attached to Allah. They are attached to being the kind of person who appears attached to Allah. That sentence stings because it exposes something real. The nafs does not disappear when you become religious. It becomes religious. Ibn Arabi discusses throughout Al-Futuhat how the ego can appropriate spiritual forms. The ego does not always fight holiness. Sometimes it hides. Inside holiness, imagine a king disguising himself as a servant. Everyone celebrates because they think the king disappeared, but he never left. He simply changed clothes. That is the nafs. Before religion, it wanted status through money. After religion, it wants status through piety. Before religion, it wanted admiration through success. After religion, it wants admiration through sincerity. The costume changes. The nature remains. Modern psychology calls this identity protective cognition. Researchers have found that people instinctively defend anything connected to their self-image. Once righteousness becomes part of identity, honest self-examination becomes difficult, because every weakness feels like a threat, every mistake feels like an attack, every criticism feels personal. Ibn Arabi described the same problem in spiritual language. The veil becomes thicker because it now wears sacred clothing, and this creates a strange phenomenon. You begin protecting an image instead of pursuing. Transformation growth requires admitting incompleteness. The ego hates incompleteness. The soul needs it. Have you noticed how difficult it is to confess certain flaws to yourself? Not because the flaws are large, because they contradict the identity you built. You can admit weakness as long as the weakness still fits your self-image. But some truths threaten the image entirely. That is why they remain hidden. The danger of Ujub is not simply pride. The danger is stagnation. The moment you become invested in being good, you stop becoming better, because improvement requires humility, and humility requires seeing reality, not preserving an image. Many viewers will recognize this immediately. The same self that once wanted worldly status now wants spiritual status. The same self that once wanted admiration now wants admiration for not wanting admiration. The nafs has simply changed its costume. It has not changed its nature, and Ibn Arabi is forcing us to confront a painful question. When you worship, who is receiving the emotional reward? Your soul or your image? Because if your image receives the reward, the ego remains in control. Your greatest idol may be the version of yourself you admire. But Ibn Arabi does not stop there. Most people think the problem is pride. He goes deeper. The real problem is perception itself, and this is the part most Islamic content never reaches. Think of a woman who spent 10 years memorizing the Quran. People respect her, students seek her advice. Her recitation moves hearts. Then one day she notices a fear she cannot explain. What if I lose this? At first she thinks she is afraid of forgetting Quran. But when she looks closer, she discovers something deeper. She is afraid of losing the identity attached to it. The respect, the role, the certainty, the image. That realization changes everything, because now she sees that her attachment is not only to the gift, it is also to the self created around the gift. This is exactly where Ibn Arabi takes the discussion. In Fusus al-Hikam and throughout Al-Fatahat, he repeatedly returns to the idea that human beings are loci of manifestation. Goodness appears through them. Wisdom appears through them. Guidance appears through them. But they do not independently own these realities. The shocking implication is this. The problem is not merely pride. The problem is mistaken vision. You are seeing reality incorrectly. Imagine an actor stepping onto a stage. He wears a costume. He plays a role. Then halfway through the performance, he forgets he is acting. He starts believing the costume is his actual identity. That confusion creates every other problem. This is what happens spiritually. You forget the distinction between what passes through you and what belongs to you. Now here is where this becomes truly counterintuitive. Ujub is not thinking too much of yourself. Ujub is thinking too much about yourself. There is a difference. A proud person thinks about himself constantly. An insecure person also thinks about himself constantly. One feels superior. One feels inadequate. Yet both remain trapped inside. Self-reference. Both remain centered on themselves. Most people never consider this. They assume humility means developing lower self-esteem. Ibn Arabi points somewhere else entirely. The opposite of Ujub is not self-rejection. The opposite of Ujub is absorption in Allah. When Allah becomes the center of attention, the self naturally moves to its proper place. Not because you hate yourself, because you stop orbiting yourself. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your spiritual life is actually self-evaluation? How often are you thinking, am I sincere? Am I progressing? Am I improving? Am I special? Am I failing? Notice the common word. I. The content changes. The center remains. This is why some people become exhausted by spirituality. Not because worship is exhausting, because they have turned spirituality into endless self-monitoring. Modern psychology calls part of this process self-referential processing. The mind becomes trapped in constant reflection upon itself. Researchers link excessive self-focus with anxiety, rumination, and emotional instability. Ibn Arabi recognized the spiritual version centuries earlier. Science describes the mechanism. Ibn Arabi tells you what to do about it. Move attention, return the gaze, remember the source, because the longer the self remains center stage, the stronger Ujub becomes. Whether that self feels proud or insecure hardly matters. Ujub survives anywhere the self remains the center of attention. But if attention can move away from the self, what does that actually look like? What does freedom from Ujub feel like in real life? That brings us to the final teaching. Think of an elderly man who quietly cleans a masjid every Friday. No photographs, no social media, no announcements. For years he arrives before everyone. Else, he vacuums carpets, he arranges shoes, he wipes windows, then he leaves. One day, someone thanks him publicly. His reaction surprises everyone. He seems genuinely confused, not falsely humble, not performing modesty, actually confused, as though the idea of receiving credit never occurred to him. Why? Because he never built an identity around the action. This is where Ibn Arabi's understanding of servanthood becomes transformative. Throughout Al-Futuhat, he teaches that the deeper a servant's awareness of Allah becomes, the less fascinated that servant becomes with himself, not because deeds disappear, because perception changes. Allah occupies more space, the self occupies less. Imagine standing beneath a mountain. The larger the mountain appears, the smaller your self-consciousness becomes. You stop thinking about yourself because something greater captures your attention. That is what happens spiritually. The servant still prays, still strives, still repents, still serves. But the emotional spotlight shifts, and this resolves the tension we have been building throughout the video. Teaching 1 showed how the ego claims actions. Teaching 2 showed how the ego claims identity. Teaching 3 showed how the ego distorts perception. Now we arrive at freedom. Freedom is not achieved by obsessing over sincerity. Freedom arrives when Allah becomes more real than your self-image. This is why the Prophet, peace be upon him, taught that nobody enters paradise by his deeds alone. Not because deeds are unimportant, because dependence matters. The hadith breaks spiritual ownership. It reminds the servant that salvation remains rooted in divine mercy, not personal achievement. Have you ever met someone whose presence feels peaceful, not impressive? Peaceful, someone who never seems interested in proving anything. Often those people possess a quality that modern culture rarely understands. Their attention is not trapped inside themselves. They are free from the exhausting burden of self-display. Many viewers will recognize another uncomfortable truth here. You have spent years evaluating your spirituality, scoring it, measuring it, comparing it. Meanwhile, you rarely noticed how much attention you were giving yourself. Ibn Arabi invites a different orientation, not self-neglect, not self-hatred, servanthood, a condition where Allah becomes the central reality around which everything else is organized. And when that happens, worship becomes lighter, not easier, lighter, because you stop carrying the additional weight of self. The healthiest soul remembers its deeds least and Allah most. But there is one final paradox waiting for us, and it may be the most unsettling insight in the entire discussion. The most dangerous form of ujub is not pride in worship, it is pride in humility. This is where Ibn Arabi becomes deeply challenging, because the ego can survive almost any attack. Expose arrogance, it becomes proud of self-awareness. Expose vanity, it becomes vain about simplicity. Expose pride, it becomes proud of humility. The costume changes, the actor remains. Most people imagine spiritual growth as a process of removing ego, layer by layer, that Ibn Arabi points toward something more radical. The ego cannot cure itself through self-obsession. The cure is not endless self-analysis. The cure is displacement. Attention must move. Many discussions of humility accidentally create another trap. People here think less of yourself than they spend years thinking about themselves negatively, but they are still thinking about themselves. The center has not changed. Only the emotional tone changed. Ibn Arabi's deeper insight is this: do not think less of yourself, think of yourself less. That single shift rearranges everything, because now the goal is not self-condemnation, the goal is witnessing. Mu, Shahadah. Seeing Allah's action, mercy, wisdom, and generosity so clearly that self-fascination begins fading naturally, a servant can spend decades fighting pride, while remaining completely occupied with himself. That is the paradox. The ego remains center stage. The script changes. The actor stays. True sincerity emerges when Allah becomes more interesting to you than your spiritual progress, when His generosity becomes more captivating than your achievements, when His mercy becomes more real than your image. This is the point most discussions never reach. The battle was never merely against pride. The battle was against self-centered perception. The costume changes. The actor stays unless attention moves. Let us make this practical, not next month, not after another book. Tonight, practice number 1 is called the attribution shift. Every evening write down 3 spiritual successes from your day. Then next to each one answer a question. What had Allah already given me that made this possible? You prayed, Fajr, good. Who gave you health? Who woke you? Who guided you? Who sustained your faith long enough to reach that moment? This practice interrupts spiritual ownership and strengthens gratitude. Practice number 2 is called the hidden deed experiment. Choose one act of worship that nobody will ever know about. Not your spouse, not your friends, not your followers. Nobody protects it completely. The purpose is not secrecy itself. The purpose is starving the ego of recognition. Modern psychology calls this reward decoupling. When external validation disappears, motivation becomes purified. Science describes the mechanism. Ibn Arabi tells you why it matters. Because the nafs feeds on attention. Remove attention. The appetite weakens. Practice number 3 is called the attention audit. After every significant act of worship, ask yourself, for the last 5 minutes, was I thinking more about Allah or about myself? Do not judge the answer. Observe it. Awareness comes first. Transformation follows. This practice reveals patterns that usually remain invisible. You begin noticing how often worship quietly becomes self-reference, how often remembrance becomes evaluation, how often gratitude becomes ownership, and once you can see the pattern, you can interrupt it. That is the beginning of freedom, not perfection, freedom, because sincerity is not achieved through force. It emerges when perception becomes clear, when Allah returns to the center, when the self returns to its proper size. Return to the scene we started with. You finish the prayer. You complete the fast. You resist the temptation. And afterward, a quiet voice appears. Maybe I am becoming special. At the beginning of this video, that feeling seemed harmless. Now you can see why. Ibn Arabi treated it so seriously, not because worship is dangerous, not because joy in obedience is wrong, because the gaze slowly shifted from Allah's generosity to your reflection, from gratitude to ownership, from witnessing to self-admiration. And once that shift occurs, sincerity begins weakening from the inside. The transformation we were aiming for was never self-hatred, never insecurity, never denying your good deeds. The goal was seeing them correctly. Every act of obedience is an invitation. Every moment of sincerity is a gift. Every opening is a mercy. The sincere servant does not deny what Allah allowed him to do. He simply refuses to worship it, and that changes. Everything worship becomes lighter, the heart becomes softer, the soul becomes freer, because it no longer carries the burden of maintaining a spiritual image. The purest heart is not the one impressed by its sincerity, it is the one too occupied with Allah to admire itself. And before you leave, sit with this question honestly. Think of the version of yourself that worships. Is that person worshipping Allah? Or has that person quietly started worshipping the image of someone who worships Allah?